Okay, so welcome. We are going to cover the purchase agreement. This is the 2026 version. So every year, IAR uh, puts out a new version. So just be cognizant that you're using the one that says 2026. If you're a list agent and you get a purchase agreement and it's dated from last year, that's okay. It doesn't make it any less legal. It's just not going to be the most up-to-date version. So we have the 2026 version here today. We're going to start at the top where you're going to put in the listing broker name, their office code, the list agent's name, and then their MyBoard number. And then it's a little confusing, but the selling broker would actually be synonymous with buyer's agent. So we are Keller Williams Indy Metro North, and our office code is KWIN01. And you're going to have your name and then your MyBorn number. We want to make sure that everything's filled out. So you're going to have that date uh, filled in. And then I always think it's a good idea to obtain your client's legal name or essentially how they want to sign their documents throughout the transaction. So, I'm Doug, but I would probably want to sign as Douglas W. So I think it's just best practice that you say, hey, I know we're going to call you by this name, but as far as signing goes, um, you know, let's have some clarity up front so then everything can match. It's not a big deal if you need to change the buyer name. Like if you have a corporate client who's an LLC or something like that, technically, whoever's going to take title or how it's going to be titled should probably read line three. So ABC Holdings, that's where that company name could go in, and then they may sign with their name, comma, authorized signer or representative or member. I always like to default to the title company as well, because they may have a particular way that they want it to be signed, but you can clean that up via an amendment to purchase agreement if that's necessary down the line. Shouldn't be a big deal. Property address, certainly you want to get that correct. Fun fact, the address is really for the post office and the fire department. So that legal description is super important in regards to the transfer of the deed. So you want to take your time and get that legal description filled in as accurately as possible. You can pull that off of the BLC and public records. Um, so yeah, we got the street address, the township, the county, the zip, and then the legal description. Again, legal description is super important because that's what is going to be the property that conveys. So if you're in an urban area and you have a situation where there's a maybe a adjoining lot, so it kind of makes that yard bigger and you can be like, hey, all these houses look like they have the same size yard and then this one is double. You might want to take a look and see if that other part of the yard is a separate parcel and you would need to include that parcel number in your legal description. There could be a situation where you're in a more rural area and, let's say your client is buying 10, 20, 50 acres. There could be different parcels that make up that overall, um, s- you know, acreage. So again, just want to be super um, intentional on the legal description. And if you need to do an addendum one, to flush everything out, then that would be the place to do it. Below that is basically everything that kind of has that boilerplate language on what's going to convey with the property. And another point of emphasis for me is anything that you expect to stay with the house needs to be in the contract somewhere. So I've written in everything your buyer expects to convey with the property. If it's not in the purchase agreement, it's not part of the contract. This supersedes what is listed in the BLC or the seller sales disclosure. So it does not matter what they put in the BLC info sheet. It does not matter what they fill out in the seller sales disclosure. If your buyer is expecting the clothes washer and dryer, it must be in the contract. Anything that your client is expecting to be there when you do the final walkthrough, and it's if there's any type of gray area, you really need to list it in the contract. If it's not in the contract, I can't help you. Point of emphasis. Put it in the contract. It can go here, lines 17, 18, 19, or it can go in further conditions. If it reaches a certain point, if you're kind of getting a lot of personal property, then best practice is to transfer that to the personal property addendum, which is an IAR form. The lender doesn't like it when there's a ton of personal property because they feel like it creates an imbalance between the appraised value and what you're actually getting. So if you're going anything probably beyond what I would call like our normal appliances, kitchen appliances, clothes washer, dryer, stuff like that, if you're getting into like the pool table and the hot tub and the patio furniture and stuff like that, then you're better off using the personal property addendum, and that would be between buyer and seller, and you would not send that to the lender. It's just kind of a separate sidecar. Um, in that same vein, if your buyer also has an opportunity to exclude anything, so if there's a sandbox or a play set or whatever your buyer client is not interested in, then everything is negotiable at this point, and it's always negotiable, and they can include that term in that section if there is something that they needed to say, hey, we don't want X. Again, in that bold paragraph there, it says the terms of this agreement will determine what items are included and excluded, not the seller's sales disclosure form, multiple listing service, or other promotional materials. Okay. All right. It is on the buyer to kind of verify some of these pieces of information. So if your buyer is has raised their hand and said, "Hey, this is super important to me," then you need to be taking next steps to determine anything that they're interested in. So that could be the square footage, that could be additional parcels, um, the neighborhood information. It's really on on you as the buyer's agent and the buyer to do your due diligence and learn enough about the property such that you're, interested enough to submit the offer. So, it's really not on the seller so much, more as it's on the buyer to verify the information that's been provided by the list agent, by the seller. Okay, price. This is an important one because everyone wants to talk about money. So that first blank is going to be numerals. So you're going to put numbers in that first blank, and then depending on your software system, mine automatically would auto-populate the words that spell out what the purchase price amount is. But you're going to do numbers and then words, and best practice is to have both of those completed. If the buyer obtains an appraisal of the property, this agreement is contingent upon the property appraising at no less than the agreed upon purchase price. If the appraised value is less than the agreed upon purchase price, buyer retains the option to proceed toward closing at the agreed upon purchase price. If buyer is not willing or able to proceed at the agreed upon purchase price, then either party may terminate this agreement or the parties may mutually agree to amend the agreed upon price. So that is a super wordy but yet important paragraph. So as it lies right now, if your buyer client is getting a mortgage, then it is contingent upon the property appraising. If the appraisal comes in low, then either party may terminate the agreement or the parties may mutually agree to amend the price. So if we have a $300,000 purchase price and the appraisal comes in at 290, if the buyer does not want to come up to 300, then either party can terminate or the parties may mutually agree to change the price. Amend is essentially synonymous with change. So, um, the seller cannot just walk if the appraisal comes in low and the buyer agrees to make up the difference. Okay. But if the buyer doesn't want to make up the difference, if the seller doesn't want to take less, then either party can terminate and it's over. Or you can agree on a different price. It doesn't have to be what it appraised for. It can be a different number in between what the appraised value was and what the purchase price is. And the mortgage is going to be based on the appraised value. So the additional cash that the buyer would bring to the table would be to make the seller whole and fulfill the terms of the contract, but the mortgage amount is going to be based on the appraised value. Um, Depending on the market, depending on the conditions, if you're in a multiple offer situation, whatever it may be, you could choose to use the appraisal gap addendum, which is an IAR form, and that essentially signals to the seller on how the buyer is going to navigate a situation where you have a low appraisal. So if you're in a multiple offer situation, if it is a situation where you're trying to improve the terms of your buyer's offer and it's not necessarily paying the most possible, but it's a combination of terms and price. It's not always about price. So one way to improve your terms could be to include the appraisal gap addendum, which says, hey, in the event that the appraisal comes in low, I'm telling you up front we have a certain amount of cash that we're going to include as a term that we're going to bring to the table to insulate you from the possibility of a low appraisal. So in this situation, if we have a $300,000 house and your buyer client has the resources to do it, they could say, hey, as part of our offer, we're going to say that we have a $10,000 low appraisal gap coverage addendum filled out. Here's our proof of funds that shows that we have this money that we're going to bring as additional cash to close if the appraisal comes in low. Are there any questions about the low appraisal or how to weave in the appraisal gap coverage as a term? Okay. So just keep that in mind as a way to layer on um, positive things that could separate you in the event of a multiple offer situation. If you're head to head, I'm probably more interested in an appraisal gap coverage addendum than if you're putting 5 or 20% down, because if you're putting 20% down, that's great. It, um, in theory, it sounds like the buyer client would have some money that they could shift over to that if they needed to. So that's why it's also important to be working with a local trusted lender so you know kind of what is on the menu of options for your buyer client when it comes to cash to close, when it comes to their loan product. And that financing section is just a couple sections away here on page 2. We'll circle back with that. So the earnest money, line 39 is negotiable. In our market, traditionally, it's about 1%. However, that term, along with all the other terms, is completely negotiable. Again, it's not a ton, it's not a huge needle mover, so just know that that is another tool in the toolbox that you could say, hey, on a $500,000 house, I'd probably want to see somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 as a list agent, as a buyer's agent, and yet you could increase that amount if you wanted to. I would probably choose other areas to improve your offer. But again, the earnest money amount is negotiable, and in our market, it's around 1%, I would call as a baseline. Um, and then you have a certain amount of time for that earnest money to be delivered. Um, Me just trying to be as intentional as possible as I like to write in 3 banking days after acceptance. I know when banks are open, I don't know necessarily how to define a business day. So that's just a little nuance to how I write that in. But you could put 3, 5, 7, 10, 30 days. Again, it's all negotiable. If you know that your buyer client may have some headwinds on actually executing that delivery, give yourself a longer runway to complete that action. Now, with our electronic transfer options, it should be a little bit more straightforward. But just know that if they fail to deliver the earnest money within the defined time, the seller can terminate the agreement, which is what it goes on to say in the rest of that paragraph. Disbursement of the earnest money. Um, so essentially, if there is an earnest money dispute and the broker is holding the earnest money, then we can initiate a 60-day letter, is what we call it, and essentially says that if neither party initiates litigation, then the broker who's holding the money is going to give it to their client. If both parties agree that the title company is going to hold the earnest money, that is no longer an option. The only way the earnest money gets returned if the title company is holding it is if there's a fully executed mutual release or a court order. So that's the downside of the title company holding the earnest money is that they're not a broker and therefore a 60-day letter cannot be initiated. So again, it's negotiable on who holds the earnest money. I would say traditionally it's going to be the listing broker. However, if you're writing this purchase agreement and you check selling broker, then that means that your client would deliver the earnest money here to KW. We would hold it. And if there was an earnest money dispute, and we sent the 60-day letter to both parties by certified mail and no action was taken, then we would deliver it to your client. Um, so just keep that in mind as kind of one of the ways that this would play out. We don't really get involved with earnest money disputes because they're between the buyer and the seller. And just know that if there is a situation where you're at a stalemate and the buyer is wanting to get their earnest money back, really they need to sue the seller for it in the appropriate jurisdiction. Based on the amount, it could be small claims court. If it's over that threshold, which is I think like $6,500 or something like that, then it would go to the next applicable court. Um, so if you get an earnest money dispute, then I'm sure you'll probably reach out, which is fine. Any questions about earnest money? It can be a personal check. That's fine.
Do they have to be in envelopes when they deliver them?
Doesn't have to be, but potentially best practice. Just put a little bit more information on there, like address, agent name, client name. I mean, the more information, the better when it comes to stuff like that. Method of payment, cash is still king. And I would just say if you are working with a investor client, make sure that you get a good proof of funds up front from them. Number one, depending on where you are in your career arc, there are lots of investors out there that, you know, they want to transact, but at the same time, they may not be the most loyal, 100%. I'm only going to work with you. You could be in a situation where, hey, you know what? If you find a deal, I'd be happy for you to represent me. So just kind of as a part of your order of operations, when you're considering working with a certain client, I would ask for a proper proof of funds. And to me, that's something that they have the amount of money in one place with their name on it that matches the name of how they're going to write the offer. That to me would be like the best case scenario. So if you have ABC Real Estate Investing, best case would be they have that money with that name in a bank account that, exceeds the amount of money that they would need to transact. Does that always happen? No. Um, but if I'm the list agent, I don't love it when I have like four different screenshots of bank accounts and then I'm supposed to do the math and figure out, okay, based on what you showed me, you have proof of funds that says, we have enough money to transact on this property. So again, if you're considering working with someone, you have an opportunity to kind of say, hey, here's how we're going to do this. And if we're moving forward, I need you to send me proof of funds. As a list agent, again, you're going to want to have some scrutiny on what that looks like. I would say best practice and to be more efficient is you're going to submit the proof of funds with the offer, not within a certain days of acceptance. Um, if they fail to submit the proof of funds within that time frame, the seller can terminate the agreement using the notice of termination, which is an IAR form. Line 65 sometimes gets overlooked where you do need to declare if the buyer is going to have an appraisal or not. The whole point and the whole advantage of cash is that you're not making the appraisal a contingent term of the offer. So if you're a cash buyer, but you are going to have an appraisal, then you really haven't moved yourself to the front of the line. It is within their right to do it if you feel like that's, a necessary um, part of the order of operations that you want to have done, then the buyer does have the ability to ask or and have the appraisal done. But 9 times out of 10, that is probably not the path that you're going to take if you're working with a client who is a cash buyer. More times than not, especially again, kind of based on that career arc, is you're going to be working with buyers that are going to be getting a new mortgage. So you're going to check 66, new mortgage. The completion of this transaction shall be contingent upon the buyer's ability to obtain, and then you're going to check one of those boxes that would reflect the loan product that they're using. Again, I think it's super important that you have existing relationships with local lenders because they are really an extension of your team. At this point, I have the luxury of really encouraging my clients to use the people that I'm in rhythm with and have relationship with. If your business looks a little bit different, then maybe that's not going to be as high of a priority on your list. But I'm just telling you that I have less headaches, I have less headwinds if you're working with people who you're already kind of in rhythm with and that they've provided a good pre-approval letter for your buyer clients. So just as we were talking about the proof of funds, before you put someone in your car, before you start spending a bunch of time and investing your energy in a buyer client, it is such a good idea to have a true pre-approval letter, which means that they've taken all their documents that they need and they've given it to the lender. The lender has reviewed everything. Potentially it's gone to underwriting and back, but you know that when you get that pre-approval letter from the lender, that they've been vetted and then they're qualified to transact. If you don't have that, if you get a pre-qual letter, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but a pre-qual is essentially based on what the buyer or borrower has told the lender, you would be approved for this amount, but they haven't actually proved that they can get a loan for a certain amount. So again, number one, get a good pre-approval letter. I think best practice is to get in rhythm with a local lender who you have, the ability to build your business with, you can count on, go from there. So the percentage of the amount there you're going to fill in on line 68, that's going to be what the loan amount would be for. So if your client is putting 20% down, then you would put 80% of the purchase price is what the loan is going to be for. Most common loan product is a 30-year mortgage. However, believe it or not, there are mortgages less than 30 years. There's 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. So the lender is probably going to lead with that 30-year mortgage option because it's the most affordable monthly payment. However, based on your client's financial position, they could choose to do a loan that's less than 30 years. So again, those are conversations that you really should be encouraging the borrower, the buyer, to have with the local lender to figure out, hey, what's the best loan product for me? How much money should we put down? Where does the value of putting additional money stop? So it's like if you put 20% down, that gets you the best rate. But if you put 30% down, maybe that doesn't move the needle. So again, those terms are negotiable, and it's really a situation where I think the buyer, should be doing what's best for their financial position and then translate that to the terms that you're going to offer the seller. The buyer would be responsible for all costs of obtaining financing, except any concessions that would be agreed upon further down. And that would include like the inspections that may come with a certain loan product. Um, so yeah, time for obtaining financing. Again, if you're organized, if your client is ready to rock and roll, then that application shouldn't take too long because they should have a pretty good idea of who they're going to go with. But there's going to be a set amount of days there after the acceptance that the buyer agrees to make written application for financing. To me, that basically says, hey, we're moving forward with this loan product with this financial institution. They basically have a certain amount of time to declare, hey, here's what we're rolling with. They're getting started. That lender is ordering the appraisal. The financing piece of the transaction is moving forward in an agreed upon direction. Um, Again, I don't love this line, but it says the buyer directs lender to order the appraisal immediately. What I'll say there is that if if you find yourself in a situation where you feel like you need to wait to order the appraisal until the inspection is completed, that's okay. But you need to introduce a new term that both parties agree to, that there's going to be uh, an order of operations that we're going to say, hey, the buyer will order the appraisal after buyer and seller have agreed to any inspection response or whatever it may be. So it would be improper for you to not have the appraisal be ordered and have that process playing out unless you have new language and further conditions or somewhere else that says, hey, we're going to wait. And it's okay if that's what it needs to happen, but you're also not making the strongest offer. If you don't make any changes, the appraisal should be ordered. That should be in the queue. It should be assigned to the appraiser. That should be scheduled alongside the inspection. They should be happening simultaneously, unless you have a certain term that changes that expectation between buyer and seller. Um, Again, if we're organized, if we have a quality borrower, buyer, client, 30 days is, I would say, kind of the default timeline in our market. But that is negotiable. So based on your buyer client's preferences, based on, any information that you might have received from the listing side on what a preferred timeline is, your buyer client and you are going to make a decision on what is best for your timeline and taking into consideration, hey, if the seller wants this, are we going to appease them and we're going to line up and say, sure, you want a extended closing timeline, that again is all negotiable. So you're going to make a tactical decision on, hey, do we need to do what's best for us, or are we flexible enough that this is a term that we can agree to based on everything? You're kind of going to figure out where that priority is for your buyer client and their circumstances and how that lines up with the preferences of the seller. But, 30, 45, 60 days, probably in that range. Again, if you are working with that lender and you've got a good borrower, they could probably close a loan in 3 weeks. So just know that if that doesn't happen in that time frame, then there's the potential that the seller can say, "Hey, you didn't get approval, your financing didn't come through within a certain amount of time. I'm out because I got something better." So you do want to be intentional about how many days you're giving your buyer client to get that approval, because once that expires, then you're giving yourself some exposure there, in regards to being able to move forward if the seller wants out. Now, a lot of times the seller still wants to sell, the buyer still wants to buy, and you have that extended, but that takes an amendment to the purchase agreement if you're not ready to close and your financing window is over. Cool. All right. Seller contributions. So we have two different subjects here. One is seller concessions. The other is buyer broker compensation. So seller shall provide an allowance up to X dollars of purchase price to be used by buyer toward any allowed closing costs. So this is money that the seller is going to say, "Hey, to reduce the amount of cash that the buyer has to bring to closing, we're going to do a $3,000, $5,000, $10,000 lender approved closing cost credit." So that's going to be for origination charges charged by the lender, can be prepaids like homeowners insurance, and or uh, like what the closing costs would be charged by the title company who's going to conduct the insured closing. So there are certain caps that, based on the loan product, how much the buyer can get from the seller. So again, those are conversations that you can be having with your preferred local lender on, "Hey, again, here's our client's situation. Based on the purchase price and the loan product, they could get a maximum of $10,000 or whatever it may be." But you want to make sure that you're not over your skis on that, because there is a maximum that they can get, and you don't want that to go to waste. But that could also be used for something like buying their rate down or the 2-1 buy down or whatever it may be. But that is the seller giving the buyer a certain amount of money to offset the final cash to close amount that they would bring to the table.
Rate buy down, but you still put a dollar amount.
Yeah, I mean, you want to be crystal clear on what the expectation is that the seller is going to give the buyer. And then once that dollar amount is agreed to as a term, then the buyer can really do whatever they want with it. So I'd probably not put too much specific language in there, because you just want the seller to be on the hook for a certain amount, and then you'll figure out with the lender how the best way to actually um, put that in motion. So you can talk about, "Hey, we might be using this money for a 2-1 buy down," or maybe the seller is offering the concept of that. Like, they're a motivated seller. They were the one who raised their hand and said, "Hey, we're open to offering this as a carrot." So you take the carrot, but you may find that it's better for the borrower to do a permanent rate buy down instead of a 2-1. So you want to give yourself a little flexibility in the contract between the buyer and the seller to get the money and then have it flow through to what you mutually agree on is the best case scenario. Because I had a situation where the seller was motivated and they were the ones who were saying, "Hey, we're making money available for a seller concession." In their mind, it was going to be a 2-1 rate buy down. but in reality, it was better for the borrower to make that a permanent buy down. So, instead of it going 2% for 1 year and 1% for the next year, they said we want to move it from 6.5 to 6. And so we took that money and that's what they did with it. Okay, buyer broker compensation. This is how y'all get paid. So this is an important one. Seller to pay buyer broker in the amount of blank US dollars or X% of the purchase price. And so this percent or this dollar amount is going to reflect what you have filled out on your buyer's exclusive agency contract between you and the buyer client. So this is kind of part of the industry shakeup that happened within the last couple of years. And this number is going to reflect the amount that you and the buyer have agreed to. So essentially, you and the buyer sign a contract, the BEAC, the buyer's exclusive agency contract that says, hey, I'm working with you, you're working with me. And then at that point, the buyer is agreeing to pay you the commission of that agreed upon amount based on what your buyer exclusive agency contract reads. Then at this point, you're going to shift that responsibility from the buyer to the seller as a term of the purchase agreement. So that's part of what you need to be explaining to your buyer clients, and you want to have the confidence to do that. And if you need to do some scripting, some role play, find a partner, come to one of us to work through how to have that conversation with your buyer up front, and then also show them the path right here as a term of the purchase agreement where we say, hey, really, as part of our offer, we're asking the seller to pay the buyer broker, and that amount you you cannot make more than the amount that was agreed to in the buyer agency contract. So if you find yourself in a situation where we have a motivated seller, we have a um, new construction situation where the builder is offering a bonus or some sort of incentive, that's fine. You just have to go back and you have to amend the buyer agency contract if you're going to go and get more than what was agreed to up front. Totally legal, totally fine. It's just that whatever your gross commission is on the settlement statement needs to not exceed the amount that you agreed that you would be compensated for with the buyer up front. Okay? That's where you secure your compensation amount up front. And we would encourage you to make, what we kind of fall in with our market norms. However, that number is negotiable. And I would encourage you to protect your commission because you're going to earn it and you're going to spend a lot of time with these people. And the first thing that we don't want to see happen is you reducing your commission. Does it happen sometimes? Yes, it does. Is it better to get $8,000 than zero? Yes. But don't be too quick to start giving that away. There's a lot of money that's flying around here. It doesn't have to always be yours. So that's why you're aligned with us. That's why you're in this room. So we want to encourage you to, you know, negotiate a commission with your buyer client on what, you deserve, what you're going to earn for taking the time from start to finish. And, that starts when you meet with your client. So keep that in mind. Like, you know, even if you're the list agent, you start working with a client, you're adding value, you're putting time and energy into getting that house ready for the market. You've been working with this client for maybe a month or two before it actually goes on the market. So, that's really when you've got to, internalize and feel comfortable with the fact that, hey, you're going to earn a commission. And I say earn with purpose because you do, and you're going to earn it. So we want you also to defend it and be profitable. And so that's what I'll say about commission. And it is negotiable. We have suggestions, we have guidelines that we would encourage you to, you know, hit certain thresholds. But at the end of the day, you have the liberty to pretty much negotiate that between you and your client. And again, I wouldn't be quick to reduce this as a term in the purchase agreement. I'd find other places where you need to pull levers to make this thing work. Don't go straight to this line.
Seller doesn't agree and buyer, so extra money to pay.
Well, I'd keep negotiating because I want my full commission. So they could come back and say, oh, we're only going to pay 2%. And then you could say, all right, well, now we're going to reduce our offer amount because we want to save some cash on the sidelines to make you whole. So if the seller is going to pay two and you've agreed on three, then it's going to be up to you to say, hey, seller's paying two, you're going to pay me one. So the buyer's going to bring one, the seller's going to bring two, you're made whole at three.
Can some of it come out of concessions?
Nope, they're separate. Seller concessions are seller concessions. Broker compensation is broker compensation. You can make it look however you want, so you can it's all semantics. So if the seller concession is 5,000 and 2%, then the seller is paying the buyer 5,000, the buyer is paying you 5,000. So we're back to where we were. See what I mean?
I asked Mark yesterday, like increase my purchase price, but it didn't really click with me.
Right. So that again, the seller is just going to be concentrating on their net. So it's like, okay, well, we're going to offer a little bit more on the purchase price. So the seller is netting X and you're still netting Y.
Can I come at it a little different? If I'm the listing agent and I'm going over that sheet with the seller to say, this is what we expect you to net. Are you putting in that sheet what we expect the buyer's commission to be as well? So they already know
Yeah.
upfront.
Yeah. I'd set expectations with your seller. And because 9 out of 10 times when you're receiving offers, this term is going to be in there. So I think you're going to have a cleaner path um, to an accepted offer as a list agent if you've set those expectations with your seller that says, hey, we're agreeing to a uh, listing broker commission up front. And as part of the purchase agreement, as part of the terms of an offer that we're expecting, buyer broker compensation is, likely going to be in there and it's likely going to be this amount. And we're going to negotiate that as a term, just like we are all the other terms within this purchase agreement. It is a negotiable term, and yet, we want to take care of our cooperating brokers. And so I think that it just comes down to an expectations conversation, um, whether you're working with a buyer or a seller.
Increase the purchase price. How would your commission, like, would you have to add that somewhere else? That
So the way you determine your commission amount is from the buyer's agency contract. So whatever that number is what you're going to get from the buyer. Whatever you negotiate as terms in the purchase agreement are the terms of the purchase agreement, and it's your opportunity to have that reflect however it needs to read in the purchase agreement such that you and your buyer have the means to execute the buyer agency contract. So that's, hey, instead of, you know, 290, we're going to offer 295 with a full buyer broker commission. Or if you want to play the game, you could say, okay, we're going to say that the broker commission is X%, and oh, by the way, you're also going to provide a seller concession. Well, that seller concession again is then just going to be converted to money that the buyer has to bring to the table, And that could be to make up the difference between what the seller is offering for buyer broker compensation and what you agreed to with your buyer. All right. Okay, so on to closing. Again, this is negotiable timeline, kind of like what I alluded to with the approval. So that really you need to have some intentionality behind your timeline as far as closing goes, because this offer will expire at a certain point. If you don't have it closed, then both parties have to mutually agree to make an extension. So don't be too aggressive on your timeline, especially if you have an FHA or USDA or a loan product VA where there's more regulations, there's more rules, there's more steps that need to be taken. That needs to be accounted for in regards to your closing timeline. Um, what's kind of popular is what I've written in here, line 95, that says closing shall be honored before this date or within 3 days of final loan approval. That one, I wish it was a little bit more clear cut, because it really is a gray area in regards to, does this purchase agreement go into perpetuity because we can close anytime within 3 days of final loan approval? Well, what if loan approval never comes? So, um, it can be a little bit tricky there, depending on which side of the coin you're on, if you want to include that term or not. If I'm the list agent, I'm going to prefer kind of a hard closing date that says, if we don't have it closed by this date, then we are out, because we would have to mutually agree to extend this in writing. So it's also potentially a benefit to the buyer to have a certain hard closing date, because you could say, hey, our financing failed and we didn't get loan approval within X amount of time. We're not able to close this by this date, so we're out. If you have this kind of open-ended, it potentially can make it harder for you to exit the agreement. So there's no right or wrong. If you're the buyer client, you're probably going to default to some type of language like this where it says within 3 days of final loan approval, because I think that does kind of give you that buffer, that open-ended, hey, we're still trending towards this agreed upon closing date, but because we have this language, it is kind of subjective on, are we still under contract? Are we not? I wish I had a better answer, but if you have line 95 that's not filled in, or it says something that's more defined, then that's what we're going to go off of. So, um, as a list agent, like I said, I probably would rather not see within 3 days after final loan approval, because I want to be able to say, hey, either transact and get this financing thing figured out by this date or not, so I can pivot to the next interested party who I actually have more confidence in that can transact.
Is there, like, I've heard some people say that like they prefer certain days of the week for clothing. Do you ever take that into account, like the day of the week?
No, because I really think that's a placeholder, and that's kind of like your target date. And then if you actually get that far along, then you're going to mutually agree on a closing date and time. So that's a low priority for me, because we don't even know if this thing's going to get to the closing table, let alone what day of the week it is. So I would say, you know, it's more about a target closing timeline, and then from there, it's, hey, you know, let's schedule a closing, and based on everyone's availability, you're going to mutually agree on a actual closing date, time, day of the week. Okay, closing fee. So that is going to be what the title company charges to conduct the closing. Any of those three boxes is acceptable. Buyer, seller, shared equally. Again, depending on the circumstances, is essentially what you're going to choose to do there, but it's totally negotiable, and based on what you check is how the settlement statement will read and the associated fees. Contingency, certainly the cleanest offer or option would be that this is not contingent upon the closing of another transaction. If it is, then uh, you would fill in the information on the property that would need to close before the buyer could close on this property. And if your property is not pending, then you're going to be writing a first right, which is there's two options. Essentially, one is a drop dead, and one has a certain amount of time that the buyer would have to drop their contingency. Not going to get into that too much, but I would encourage you to lead with your client's listing and negotiate a proper timeline that would be conducive to their search. The reason I say that is because if you're writing a contingent offer, number one, you're going to have to make this offer, pretty aggressive if you're going to win out against non-contingent offers. You're almost shooting yourself in the foot out of the gate if you're trying to compete with other offers that are non-contingent. You're going to have to go above and beyond on what you're offering to get an accepted offer. And then turn around and your seller now is going to be more motivated to take less on the listing side because they want to transact and get to the closing on this one. So you're, in theory, you're not saying you're overpaying, but you're having to make a really aggressive offer because it's contingent, and then you're going to be potentially making more concessions with the listing because you want to get to the closing to buy this house. So if we lead with your client's listing, you're further along on that process that you could convey to this seller and say, hey, yes, it's contingent, but we're pending. Or yes, it's contingent, but we're through inspection and we're through appraisal. And now we're just on a holding pattern until we close. That's a different narrative than our house isn't even on the market. The other thing is that if you lead with the listing, that's what we want to do, right? We want to lead with listings as a business philosophy, as a cornerstone of your business. You want to lock down that listing, you want to get them under contract, and you want to negotiate terms in that purchase agreement that are beneficial to your seller because that's a priority because they're going to have to go somewhere. So when you're receiving offers on your listing, that is a situation where you're negotiating possession after closing. Your you have a plan where your seller client is going to close, they're going to get their proceeds, and if they can get a certain dollar amount, then maybe they're in a financial position to go to some temporary housing or short-term option, but they have their money, they've dropped their mortgage payment, so now they're non-contingent because that contingency has already closed. They have the money to then move forward and write a non-contingent offer and potentially have positioned themselves to be more successful. So that is the reason why if your client can pull it off, or you can have a conversation that reflects what I just went over on why we want to lead with your listing, we're not going to make you homeless. We're going to negotiate terms that are favorable to you, but at a certain time, they are going to have to give the keys and possession to that buyer client based on what was agreed to in that purchase agreement. And I'm just saying from experience and from, you know, where we are today, being able to write that non-contingent offer or the contingent offer with a listing that is as far along as possibly can be is a different narrative than, hey, here's my first right. Okay. All right. Good funds. Essentially, it's state law that any amount, if your cash to close is going to be over $10,000, then the buyer has to wire that. Wire fraud is a real thing, so we want to make sure that you're not sharing wire instructions via unsecure email. That needs to come from the title company, and you want to be real intentional that the buyer client has the correct wiring instructions and that they're calling and verbally confirming that with the title company. We don't share wire instructions with unsecure email. It can get hacked, and then the hacker sends a second email that looks legit but has a different routing number and bank account, and your buyer can get swindled and they can wire their money to the wrong place. So it's really important that you use care and caution on sharing wiring instructions.
Has there been any instances of that last year?
I don't know about last year, but it has happened. All right, possession. Um, if we're representing the buyer, then best case scenario is going to be that the buyer would get possession at closing. That means they sign, they get the keys. That is the preferred order of operations. If you mutually agree that a post-closing possession agreement is in play, that means that the seller retains possession until a certain date. Um, if that's the way the cookie crumbles, if that's the way it has to go, then all parties agree to that. And one of the changes here is that you basically have to fill out either a post-closing possession agreement or a pre-closing possession agreement if you're not getting possession at the time of closing. And the post-closing possession agreement is an IAR form, and I would maybe summarize it as like an abbreviated lease where it kind of spells out some of those responsibilities and who is going to do what in a situation where it's possession after closing. Line 126, you have an opportunity there to write in a dollar amount that the seller would owe the buyer if they don't give possession on the mutually agreed upon date. I'm a little aggressive here. I usually write in $1,000 because I want there to be a significant enough penalty for the seller that they don't want to pay that, and it's also hard to get. Essentially, the buyer has to sue the seller for liquidated damages, starting with potentially what that dollar amount would be. But if, let's say, you're the representing the buyer and you agreed to 10 days of possession for the seller after closing and it's $100 a day. Well, what if something happens on the seller side and they go, we're not going to be out on time. We need an additional, 5 days. I'm just going to write you a check for $500 because I made $50,000 on the proceeds, and uh, you know, I need more time, so I'll just pay you $500. If it's 5,000, they might be singing a little bit different tune. So that is a negotiable term. Again, it's usually in your best interest, the buyer's best interest, to try and get possession at closing because that means you sign and it's their house. Um, the other kind of caveat there is I'll mention the final walkthrough, and there's kind of two schools of thoughts on when you do your final walkthrough. One would be, hey, we want to do the final walkthrough and give us enough runway that if we have an issue, we can try and resolve it prior to closing. That would be the argument as to why you'd want to do the final walkthrough maybe 48 to 72 hours ahead of closing. The flip side of that would be I want to do the final walkthrough right before closing because then I get a true picture of the condition of the house, and I'm going to go from the final walkthrough to the title company and sign, and I've cut down that amount of time where something could go awry between when we saw it and when it's the buyers. I usually default to the latter of those two, so I like to do it leading right up to closing because I want that true picture. And a lot of times we've negotiated that they're going to get possession at closing. If you're not getting possession at closing, it doesn't really matter because the seller could screw something up after your buyer client is signed and before they get the keys. Now they do have responsibilities and they have to maintain the property, but the buyer essentially has to sue the seller for certain damages if the property is not in the condition that they expected it to be when they got possession. So that just gives you more incentive to have possession at closing. Probably better to have that delayed closing timeline, give the seller the ability to, pack up, move out, sign possession at closing. There are certain circumstances where, hey, maybe the seller needs the money from the proceeds of the sale to execute their move. Like they really have no other money. They're banking on the cash that they're expecting to then be able to hire the movers and do all the things that they need to do. So again, all terms are negotiable and possession and closing is an important one, or it can be. Um, the other thing I'll caution you is that, if the property is rough, if the condition is poor, you know, people don't just magically get their life together because they say, oh, yeah, I'll be out in 10 days and it'll be broom swept and there won't be any personal property left. That's not usually how it works out. If you have a disaster zone, if you've got a dirty house, if you've got a house that's full of crap, if you've got a yard full of stuff, I would really encourage you to have possession at closing because when you read the tea leaves, when you look at all the context clues of a situation, that seller doesn't magically just become neat and organized and have the ability to get everything out of their house. So that needs to be a factor in what you're agreeing to in regards to possession, because there have been many times where what was agreed to was possession after closing, and the seller did not fulfill their responsibilities and they left a bunch of crap, and now it's your buyer's problem and they have to sue the seller and track them down to try and claw back the $500 or $1,500 that your buyer had to pay for the dumpster and fire dogs or junk removal or whatever it is. It's your buyer's problem. It's your problem because the buyer's pissed off at you and you can't do anything because the seller has moved to Missouri and left half their shit. So that's why possession at closing is preferred, or maybe it's one where, hey, I don't think this is a good idea to agree to this term based on what we see. If it's, hey, we've got buttoned up Zionsville neighborhood house that's, looks clean and organized and, you know, you have context clues that these people are it's reasonable to expect that they're going to leave this house in good condition. Maybe it's a situation where, yeah, 2 weeks of post closing possession is fine and you're going to pay rent or, whatever it may be. So just point of emphasis on that topic. Um, yeah, so traditionally the seller is going to pay for utilities through the day of possession. Um, Home heating fuel is really only comes into play if you're in a rural area where the seller has a large, 1,000-gallon propane tank, and that's what they use in lieu of natural gas from a municipality. And so if you do have a situation where there is a propane tank on the property, you have to check if that's included in the sale or not. If you're working in an urban area or inside city limits, it's probably going to be not applicable. In regards to the survey, that traditionally would be a buyer cost. A boundary survey is where they come out and they set markers, and that's going to be expensive and it's going to take a while. So you really only want to do a boundary survey unless you think it needs to be done, like the property lines are not clearly defined, or it's like super important that a boundary survey is done, then you need to do it. Otherwise, it's probably unnecessary. Again, if you're working in a neighborhood and here's a house, there's a house, we pretty much know where that boundary is going to be. Um, the surveyor location report is more affordable and has a quicker turnaround, and in theory would let you know if there was a red flag, if the shed or the fence was across a boundary line. Usually that surveyor location report is going to be sufficient. However, they do not set the boundary markers. They basically go off existing information. And if you read one, it says this is good for plus or minus 3 feet. So, um, again, it's traditionally a buyer expense, and you just need to know if the boundary survey is really necessary because it could be a 2 month turnaround and it could be thousands of dollars to do a boundary survey.
Is that usually done with a survey, or is it like you can just build the fences out?
I mean, I feel like you can build a fence without one. The third party fence company may have a requirement that says, hey, we're not going to build this fence unless, a survey is done. Um, but Jerry homeowner can just put a fence up and not take proper steps. So it comes up and people squabble and the fence isn't where it's supposed to be. And, you know, just know that your buyer has certain options that they can take, that they can make a term of the contract is that, hey, you know, the survey has to be acceptable to us, or they can waive it outright. So it just kind of depends on the circumstances, and if that's a priority, then they have an opportunity to do the boundary survey or the surveyor location report. All right, flood area. I would encourage you to not have buyers buy properties that require flood insurance. I think just based where we are here in central Indiana, there are a few places along the White River where you would need to have flood insurance, but really, I think that it is an additional cost and potentially hurts resale in the future. So, unless they're dead set on being on the river or being in a certain area and they have the financial means to do so, um, I would not encourage um, your buyer clients purchasing a property in a flood area. There are just so many other houses that would, um, meet their needs without the headache of being in a floodplain.
Say that you need flood insurance.
Okay. Yeah. So, um, yeah, I mean, you'll basically kind of know which areas, really would make that applicable or not. But for the purposes of the purchase agreement, um, just go ahead and check may terminate this agreement if the property requires flood insurance, because if there is a surprise, if the lender comes back and says, hey, this is actually in this certain floodplain and you're going to have this type of flood insurance, if you've checked the appropriate box, then the buyer can get out if they no longer want to proceed because you had new information that was brought to light. Building use limitations. So this is a new section here in regards to, if you're working with a single family, owner occupied client, doesn't pertain, but this kind of flushes out um, a situation where there could be rental restrictions or short-term rental restrictions or whatever it may be. So if you are working with a investor client that's not going to live in the house, then you want to appropriately fill out this section that gives them the amount of time that they may need to do their due diligence. And if it comes to light that there is a rental cap or their intended use would not be permissible, it's pretty straightforward here on how they can get out. So if you're working with a non-owner occupant client, then you need to, it's negotiable, but I would make this agreement contingent on the satisfaction of whatever it may be. Um, and you could check both 171 and 173 based on the circumstances. Um, okay. Homeowners insurance, they're going to have a certain amount of time to obtain homeowners insurance. Okay, inspections. Inspection is probably the stickiest part of the whole deal. Your buyer client does have the ability to waive it outright. We don't necessarily endorse that. So it really needs to be, certain circumstances where your buyer would waive the inspection outright. When the market was hot and, people were just desperate trying to win and, the house we felt like was in good shape and we knew that the seller probably had a lot of leverage and wasn't going to be in a position to do repairs, or we didn't feel like there was anything that we saw. Yeah, I've written a few offers that waive the inspection outright. Or if it's the opposite and the condition is poor and you're working with a, investor client who's experienced and is going to take it down to the studs anyways, yeah, you might waive inspection. But for your traditional owner occupant buyer, you're going to have an inspection most times. And we would encourage your buyer client to have that inspection with a local licensed, trusted home inspector. Can't have Uncle Jimmy go do it. It really needs to be that third party. Then, just like a good lender, they're an extension of your team. So I would encourage you to start building a relationship with an inspector that you know, like, and trust, and that I want you to have the confidence in your inspector that they're going to do a good job and refer your client to use them versus, oh, you have to pick the inspector on your own. I don't want any liability with that. I think that's weak sauce. I think you should have the confidence in your inspector that you vetted, that you endorse and say, hey, I want you to use this person because they're good at their job. Not, oh, here's three, pick one. Mm-mm. You can, if you want to do that, if you want to say, hey, here's my short list, anyone on this list is fine. Yeah, you can do that. Or you can say, hey, usually 9 out of 10 times my client goes with this inspector, and here's why. That's my preference. Um, all it's,
Usually used for inspections.
I want you to find your own inspector because I already have my guy. So you need to feel good about your inspector, and it doesn't matter who mine is. And he's busy. Can't have him.
Nice though.
Worth a shot.
Yep. Yeah, so again, all inspections should really be at the buyer's expense, and that's important to know up front. So um again, set that expectation with your buyer client. It's a sunk cost. If the inspector goes out there and they spend their time doing the inspection, they're getting paid. It is the buyer's cost. It's not the seller's problem. If you have an inspection done and the sale doesn't go through, you know, that's on the buyer side. It's the cost of doing business. Same with the appraisal. If the appraiser goes out, it's a low appraisal, deal falls apart. borrower still has to pay the appraiser for doing their job. So you need to set expectations with your buyer client appropriately that all inspections are at the buyer's expense unless agreed upon otherwise, but that is the default setting. Um, yeah, so the seller has the responsibility to have all the utilities on, to have all areas of the property accessible. Um, so I had a situation where I was the list agent, the property was tenant occupied. So the people living in the house were not the sellers. And so maybe the communication wasn't the best between myself and the tenant, setting expectations ahead of the home inspection. But there was a vehicle parked in the garage that was inoperable, and the inspector couldn't get the attic stairs were inaccessible because the car was parked in the garage and we couldn't get the attic stairs down. So I had to pay for the inspector to go back after the tenant moved the car because I was the list agent and I didn't do a good enough job of making sure that the house was ready for the inspection. So little things like that, you should probably have some prepared material to provide a seller that says, hey, this is what you need to do to be ready for the home inspection. It's a good idea to know where the crawl space access is. It's a good idea to know where the septic tank is and the lid and the septic field. So there's a little bit more information that you can get from your seller up front if you're the list agent to help with the inspection process that is likely to happen downstream of that. So the more information that you can provide up front is going to be helpful when it does come time for the inspection. Um, on the buy side, you may not have as much information as you would like, but that inspection period is your time to flush out all that information, whether it's, you know, having the additional ancillary tests like if you're on a well, there's a difference between the performance of the well equipment and a water test, right? A water test sample is going to say, hey, is there bacteria? Is there, bad stuff in the water? Which is different than how the well itself gets water to come out of the faucet. They're two separate things. So you need to be intentional about what type of inspections you're doing to the benefit of your buyer client. You also want to make sure that you're giving yourself enough time to have the inspection, to have the inspector out and formulate a response and get that back over to the seller. So, it's negotiable. Of course, the seller wants a shorter time frame. The buyers, we want to give yourself a long enough runway. Um, but I'm usually going to ask for 14 or 15 days, with the caveat being as soon as we go under contract, we're scheduling that inspection to be, taking place as soon as possible so we can get the inspection done and then we can dispatch other contractors that may need to go out and provide more information because they're a specialist or we need an estimate, we need an evaluation. And so my philosophy is we want to try and get the inspection scheduled quickly and have it completed sooner than later. So then when we have more information available to us, we can get that third party contractor out and I'm sending estimates and a solution with my buyer inspection response one. I'm not just saying, hey, here's our laundry list of stuff we want, go figure it out. I feel like if I'm going to be asking the seller to make all these repairs or make these concessions, I want to do my part on the buy side that sets the table for not only bringing more clarity to the situation in regards to, hey, how much are some of these things going to cost, but also, we've done our part and here's, who we know, like, and trust. And if you want to just have them do the repairs. We've given you an option here that the seller could consider or not but I feel like that's more helpful to not only take away some of the guesswork because the buyer always thinks it's going to be a bigger deal. Seller is always going to try and find, somebody to do it for less. But a lot of times, people are going like this, butting heads on an inspection response, partly because we don't know what it's going to cost. We don't know what the scope of work is. So by efforting to provide more information and have your people that you know, like, and trust out there to make an evaluation, to have an informed opinion, to provide more information to your buyer client, we want to make sure that you have enough time in your inspection period to accomplish that. And the other reason is, we didn't take 15 days to then dump buyer inspection response one that's 4 pages long. We took the 15 days to get us further along and provide the additional information so that once the seller gets it, we're further along in the process. You also have the opportunity there on line 225 to have an additional amount of days like automatically built in. And you can just check a box that says, hey, we're using our additional days that we mutually agreed to up front. And if I have more days on line 215, I'm probably going to have less days on 225. I'd rather have more time up front that I'm going to use with purpose. And you're probably not going to have, those be equal. Um, but rarely do I have a need to use my additional days because I'm organized and I've gotten what I needed to get accomplished in that first period. Yeah, so I would definitely spend some time here reading through the paragraphs and the language that have to do with inspection. It's all there. The seller is really only responsible for defects as defined by the purchase agreement. The definition of a defect is there. It's subjective. And so a tale as old as time that the buyer is going to squabble about it being a defect. The seller is going to say, no, it's not. And it's your job to continue to negotiate and, find the outcome that makes it a win-win. And just know that, if you're asking for a bunch of stuff, it's not a defect. The seller is not responsible for that. And I can't necessarily tell you, what's a defect and what's not. I can only, you know, show you here how it's defined and go from there. If there is a previously disclosed defect, then it's important that you know that you can't ask for that to be addressed as part of the inspection. So on the seller's sales disclosure, if they say, hey, you know, the master shower isn't working, the master shower is defective, and they disclose it, you can't come back and say, hey, fix the master shower unless you've particularly included that language and brought it back into play. So it would be proper for the seller to disclose anything that they legally need to if there is a defect or if there is something that's defective and they disclose it. Okay, they've done their part, but you have to bring that back into frame if you want the ability to address that as part of your transaction. If they disclose it up front and you don't specifically say, hey, we want the ability to ask for this to be repaired or remedied, then you cannot include that as part of your inspection response if they have previously disclosed it and you don't bring it back into play. Yeah, it just depends. That would probably be the right place for it. It's going to be a case by case basis because when you put it in the contract and you put it in further conditions, that also means that the lender is going to see it and the lender is going to then have scrutiny on anything that you make a term. that the buyer wants satisfied prior to closing, now the lender kind of has a say in that. They're going to want proof of performance on anything that is in the purchase agreement. So sometimes, not all the time, there could be an addendum 0 or another addendum that doesn't go to the lender, but it's just between the buyer and the seller only, so that you can maybe have less scrutiny on that specific topic because that didn't make it to the lender. It's a gray area. There's some nuance to it, but kind of like the personal property addendum, that personal property addendum is between buyer and seller. It's a legally binding part of the contract, but that didn't get scrutinized by the lender because it was on a separate piece of paper, and that piece of paper didn't go to the lender. So sometimes there could be a situation where, um, we want to have, an agreement in writing on a certain topic, but for less scrutiny, it doesn't go to the lender. That's also why the lender does not see any of the inspection response documents. They're blissfully unaware. They just think that every house is perfect. They think every house is in good shape, that it doesn't need repairs because they're the one that's holding the note. So if you are in a situation where a financial resolution is what was agreed to as, you know, what we're going to do to satisfy the inspection stuff, all that information is being traded between inspection response, seller inspection response back and forth. And if at the end it was agreed to that the seller is going to provide a $3,000 closing cost credit in lieu of repairs, then that's what would be reflected as kind of the final piece of the inspection response. And then you're going to take that and you're going to transfer it to an amendment to purchase agreement that says seller provide lender approved closing costs in the amount of $3,000. And you're not saying why, you're just saying that's what we're going to do. And everyone probably knows why, but it's not because of the inspection issue that's unresolved. So my point there is that you just need to be intentional about how you do your paperwork, and anything that's in the contract that goes to the lender, they're going to have an opportunity to say, we don't like that, or hey, you know, well, you told us that this is broken, and if we're gonna approve this loan, as the person who's taking on the note, we want this to be fixed. They always want everything to be fixed. So you know, their asset is in the best shape it can be because they're the ones who are holding the note on it. So, um, just be cognizant of that in regards to your negotiating your inspection response, whatever the outcome is, so be it. And then you need to transfer that to likely an amendment, because an amendment is a change to the purchase agreement. An addendum would be an addition. It's kind of one way to help you know if you're going to use an amendment or an addendum. One is a change, one is an addition. There's no real right or wrong. Um, I think people maybe use addendums more often than they should because it really is an amendment. But at the end of the day, you're going to get something in writing that says how we're moving forward, and it doesn't really matter what it says at the top. What matters is that the terms were agreed to between the buyer and the seller. The other thing is that let's say that, hey, in lieu of repairs, you're gonna cut a check to the plumber for $1,000, and the plumber is gonna come do the work after closing. That's fine, but the lender is expecting that anything that the seller is paying for on the seller side settlement statement is that work has been completed, and the contractor's getting paid from the seller proceeds because the seller didn't want to pay for it out of pocket. So the way that you're setting it up is that the work has been done because here's the paid invoice. So I don't know if the work's always going to get done or not, but that in the eyes of the lender who's looking at the settlement statement is, hey, these are seller paid invoices. And so there's some strategy in what paperwork gets submitted to the title company, who's then going to put that dollar amount on the settlement statement as a debit to the seller side that then creates the check from the title company made payable to that third party contractor. So and I'm just telling you, in the eyes of the lender, it's because the work was already done. That's their expectation. So the paperwork that they may ask for needs to be such that they would approve it and allow that to be put on the settlement statement. And also, I wouldn't put yourself or your buyers in a position where the scope of work is such that you would be risking something deviating from, you know, what what we think was going to happen for any repairs that would be done after closing. So if there's a situation where once they take something off, the job could triple in scope of work and associated costs. I wouldn't want to put my buyer client in a situation that puts them in a bad spot where we would be able to uncover new information and additional cost after closing. Because once you close and the seller made some type of financial concession, unless you've held money back in escrow, you can't go back to the seller and say, hey, actually, this repair is going to cost a lot more money. We need you to kick in another 10 grand. That's not the way it works. After you reach an agreement, if it is a financial resolution where your buyer is getting money in lieu of repairs, whether it's, hey, straight up cash, or hey, here's money for that contractor to go complete this work, that's all the money that the buy side is getting. So you want to be intentional about when that possible solution is on the menu of options and when it should not be. And the best way I can say that is, if we're talking about structural foundation, again, like if you agree that that there needs to be a new roof, okay, but it's the middle of winter or it's going to rain for the next 2 weeks or the seller doesn't have the money to put the roof on, okay, but that roofing estimate comes back and everyone agrees on this dollar amount, and then they take the shingles off and there's bad roof decking, and the contract between whomever in the roofing company says, hey, if we pull this off and there's bad wood, it's $150 per section that we've got to replace. Your buyer is on the hook for that. So that's just an example of how what we think is a number that's going to stick could change once that job is underway. And okay, if you know your buyer got $20,000 for a new roof and they have to kick in two, is that the end of the world? I don't know, but it really comes down to you setting expectations with your buyer client on how that would process would play out, and say, hey, you know, if you accept this as our agreed upon resolution, then that's all the money you get. And so it just again is about setting expectations and understanding how what we think is going to be enough might not always come through dollar for dollar. Doesn't mean that your buyer client got a bad deal. They just need to be prepared and understand that if there is additional expense, then they're the ones that are assuming that cost. Home warranties. We do have a preferred home warranty provider, which is Armadillo, Steve Salerno. hmm
Ticket or goes with buyer, like the check.
Correct. Correct. There's never a situation where the seller is going to give money directly to a buyer. That's an inducement to sell. It's basically mortgage fraud. So there's never a situation where the buyer should be getting money directly from the seller. That's why it's better off that the repairs get made prior to closing, that there is a financial concession that is converted from, instead of repairs being made, now we're going to call it a seller concession. So the buyer is bringing less money to the table, and then instead of bringing that money to the table, they can bring that money and pay their contractor. Price reduction, um, you know, certified funds made payable to that third party contractor because the work was already done. So, yep, you just want to be intentional on how you're negotiating those inspection repairs and then how that finally flows through to get the money where it needs to go if that's what was agreed to. Yep, on the home warranty, depending on the circumstances, if you're not in a multiple offer situation, you know, maybe you're more likely to include that as a term. Just know that by doing so, you're reducing your net offer on what the seller would walk away with. And in this case, I think the baseline or kind of the middle of the road home warranty with Armadillo is 575. So that's my placeholder there, but it's negotiable on who pays for it. It's negotiable on who orders it. It's all negotiable. Sometimes if you don't include it as a term up front, when we are talking about inspection, that's an outlet. That's like something that you could work in as a solution or part of a solution. It's like, hey, we asked for these things and now we're gonna bring a home warranty back into play. Or as a list agent, maybe you didn't advertise as offering one as part of your marketing efforts. However, as a negotiation chip, as a piece of the overall puzzle, um, as part of the inspection response, now the seller is also going to be offering a home warranty. Sometimes that can be a little um, bit of helpful inclusion on reaching an agreement, even if you didn't have that as part of your initial offer. Seller sales disclosure. It's now a 4-page document where the seller has the responsibility to answer that truthfully and honestly, and there's a good explanation on that document. So take some time, get familiar with the seller sales disclosure, um, knowing that if I don't know is the right answer, then it might be. If that's the honest answer, that's okay. We'd rather it be don't know than just assuming. So, again, I would just encourage you to be familiar with the seller sales disclosure and have your seller fill it out to the best of their ability. A lead-based paint disclosure is going to be required for anything built 1978 or before. Title work, um, you're going to most likely check 271, which is the title insurance commitment. Um, I would say in our market, the market norm would be that the seller would pay for the owner's title insurance premium. However, that is negotiable. And then traditionally, the buyer is going to pay for the lender's title insurance premium. Um, and then we have to decide which party is going to be the directing party to title. We do have an affiliation here with Summit Title that is part of our disclosures to our buyer clients and our seller clients that certain agents do have an interest in the affiliated title company. Um, you know, we would encourage you to use the title company that we're affiliated with. However, that is negotiable not only between buyer and seller, but the seller cannot make that selection of a title insurance provider a condition of this agreement. So for majority of the time, um, you know, my rule of thumb usually is I'm going to try and fight for the title company that I know, like, and trust because I know they do a good job. But if that's like the only thing that I would counter, I'm probably not going to make that like a one line counter. If there's another reason to counter, then I would usually include that. But that's kind of my rule of thumb is if I'm the list agent and it's a clean offer and the only thing I don't like is the title company, I'm probably gonna have that be accepted by the seller client. But if there's any reason to counter other than title, I'm probably gonna weave that back in. So, you know, um, for where the majority of you are in your business, it's probably not, as high up on the priority list for you. You're just trying to get to the table, so get to the table. Taxes, kind of our default setting here would be number two. All taxes that have accrued for any prior calendar year remain unpaid shall be paid by the seller or in the form of a credit at closing. So in the state of Indiana, we pay our taxes in arrears, which means when the tax bills come out here in May of 2026, you're really paying for the property taxes that were due in May of 2025. So on the settlement statement, there's going to be two different lines of taxes. There's going to be one that's the proration for our year to date. So there is the proration for 2026 from January 1st to February 10th. There's going to be a proration for that. And then there's going to be a credit for the tax bill that's going to be due and payable in May of 2026. You're essentially getting a credit from the seller so the buyer can pay the taxes on the property when they didn't live there. That's the best way I can describe it, is that the buyer is going to be on the hook for a tax bill for when they didn't live in the house, and that's why the seller is giving the buyer a credit at closing, and it's based on the most recent tax bill, which when when they get a bill in May, they're going to pay that in full and they would have been made whole because the seller is giving them a credit on the settlement statement based on the most recent tax bill to pay it when it comes due. Um, if you have a situation where you're working with new construction, then you need to be real intentional about what you're checking because if you have new construction, that assessed value is likely only going to be on that dirt. So if you don't set proper expectations, one, with your buyer client, or two, and which better, is to come up with a different tax credit dollar amount, your opportunity to do that is line 305. So if your client is buying a new construction home, let's say that house is going to be approximately $600,000. Okay. If you check two, then when they pull that tax bill, that assessed value is probably just going to be the dirt. And so they're going to get like $300 instead of 6,000. Okay. That's the difference because the assessed value, if you check two, that's what the tax bill is going to show. So if you're working with new construction, you need to do an alternative tax proration amount because that assessed value is going to jump and that tax bill is going to jump once that is properly assessed with the asset, with the new house that's been built. That property value has increased in value because now there's a house on it, and therefore the tax base for that property has also gone up. So, kind of the rule of thumb is if you're buying a $600,000 house, 1% of that, because the homestead exemption is going to be filed on it, a reasonable number could be 1% of purchase price, because in theory, it's going to be taxed at 1% of assessed value. And because we don't have an assessed value, let's use the purchase price, because that's going to be probably higher or sufficient to not screw your buyer client out of getting a credit from the seller slash builder for when that new tax bill comes out. They have the money to pay that higher tax bill. Okay?
So can I put this in words that help my brain?
Yep.
If it was dirt and then it was built, that's when you would use 3. But if it was already built, but the builder still owns it and just hasn't had sold it yet, then you wouldn't necessarily need 3 because they may have already paid property tax on it.
Well,
Or
I
haven't
think
yet.
that's where you get burned, is because it is built, but it hasn't been assessed.
Okay,
So even if your buyer client is, maybe they're buying it from an owner occupant, but it's only a year old, it's your responsibility to check what the taxes are on it, because they could be low. It could be a situation, and that's where you get burned, is that you have a house that's built, but it has not gone through that assessment process.
so then look up the public records.
Yeah, you need to look at that tax bill, and figure out if it is assessed, and you should be able to see. It's like, hey, you know, they're saying that the annual taxes are $250. That's a red flag. It should be approximately 1% of purchase price. If they don't have the homestead exemption, it's going to be 2%. So you're going to get a big, chunky tax proration from the seller. If they're paying 2%, that amount needs to flow through to your buyer, because they're going to be paying that elevated tax bill before their homestead tax exemption gets placed on it. Then their tax rate will come down to that new rate, but you want to make sure you're capturing the non-homestead amount, because they're going to be paying a non-homestead tax bill until their homestead gets put on it.
If the seller didn't live there, like for example, like we bought a property that was owned by an investor and they didn't live there, would they not have the homestead exemption and then we have their tax bill?
Correct. Yep. All right, couple more minutes, and then I think I have to bow out here at 11:30 just based on time. So we're gonna keep cruising through HOA docs. Um, there's a certain amount of time that the seller has to give the HOA docs. There's a certain amount of time that the buyer has to review and accept them. And there's a separate amount of time that if there would have to be some type of approval. So, um, you know, it's kind of dirty, but if there's a situation where something comes up and the buyer doesn't want to move forward, if you're within your HOA approval window, you can point to that and say, "Oh, well, you know, we don't accept these and we're out." Again, it's not the best play, but sometimes you're just looking for the exit, and if with limited options, this is a line that you could point to if it's applicable. So you need to do a good job of on the list side providing those. It's probably best practice to provide those up front as a supplement in the BLC, and just have that clarity out there for everyone up front, so it's less of an issue once you go under contract. Okay. Additional provisions, you can read on your own, but it does say in black and white right here. There is a sex offender registry. It is kind of on the buyer slash you to look up that type of information if that's if that's a priority. We basically disclosed that that's a thing, and you know you might want to check, because who is the buyer going to be mad at if, that ends up happening and you didn't take that step to, you know, do appropriate due diligence. Number 5. Yeah, so generally that is going to be a warranty deed. Uh, so I wouldn't worry about it unless it really comes up.
Do you just put it?
Yeah, I just put the // hyphen. Tori, you ready? Cool. Well, I am recording, so let me stop my recording. Did that. Yeah, any other questions? We got through most of it. And I want to be respectful of Tori's time. So I guess I'll just end with you know, if you do have an offer that has expired, best preference is to really resubmit an offer and have a fresh expiration time and date. As a broker, I don't love it when I see something that basically has brought the offer back to life through a counter. Sometimes the list agent will say, hey, you know, seller to have until this new time and date to respond. Broker perspective is I don't think that's the best way to do it because once an offer expires, it's expired. So I'd rather you resubmit a fresh purchase agreement or whatever needs to happen so the seller can counter or accept it within the defined time period. All right. Thanks for coming. Hope you all have a good week of Ignite, and I'm around to help any way I can.
Thanks, Doug.
All right.
You're the man, Doug.
Appreciate it.
I needed to remember this because this is very long.
Yep. All right, Tori.
Sorry,
I'm gonna bring in lunch.
All right.
Tori and we have to do a little swap. He's next, but go ahead and take a break.
I know. Oh,
Yeah, well, I guess-
But now you won't know how to do an open.
I'll get lunch in here in just a second.
Absolutely. Isaac, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Doing well.
What? It's Jimmy John's and and I made sure I got a variety of sandwiches and there are sides and chips. In fact, if you do you mind grabbing, there's a bag up near Ashley. Can you grab that? Thanks. And then we have waters up here too. Okay, so you need your computer, right?
Yeah, I mean,